Okay, right now I'm going to go through or start on chapter 2, which is the form chapter. Form is what something is. And if you remember from the opening diagram, what we're going to develop in this class is ultimately an understanding of how form relates to function and they relate to style. So right now I'm pulling that form circle out and just covering what something is. Now, a little warning beforehand, this is something that most of you know something about. You remember parts of speech, which is really what form is. You remember this from grammar school, junior high school, and in most cases, you've probably forgotten a little bit, but boy, you thought it was horrendously boring, and I've got to tell you, it really is. There is nothing inherently interesting in my mind, and in most people's mind, about parts of speech. And I'll be quite blunt about it. In and of itself, just learning the parts of speech is almost entirely useless. If that's what you learned about grammar and that was the end of it, you learned something you can't use, and it's really tedious learning it in the first place. Where it becomes important is when it's hooked up to function. Then you start seeing what these things, what they are, and then what they can do, and how they relate to your thinking, your speaking, your writing, and everything else. So be patient with me for a bit. This is an incredibly boring chapter, and it can, if you just think of grammar as being the parts of speech, you might think, boy, this isn't very useful. But it will become extremely useful. In fact, you can't understand function without understanding form. You can't understand how you're going to use the language until you understand what things are in the first place. The other thing I'm going to ask you is to be a little bit patient. If you know something about grammar and you know your parts of speech fairly well, I'm going to go about this slightly differently, as I do most things, just a little bit differently. A lot like what you're probably familiar with, but be a little bit patient. I'm going to introduce some slightly different approaches to form here. So this is going to be about parts of speech. Most folks are familiar, somewhat familiar. If you don't remember them, you're like most people, you probably remember 8 parts of speech. I'm going to emphasize 6 parts of speech. Okay, only 6 of them. Now the 6 I'm going to emphasize are nouns and verbs, adjectives and adverbs, and prepositions and conjunctions. The 2 I'm going to tell you aren't that important are pronouns and interjections. Pronouns in the end are going to be just like nouns, almost exactly like nouns. They're very close to them. And interjections you don't really use in a standard written context. For standard written English, generally, what works is avoiding interjections. You will almost never see them used in a standard written English context, so I don't even cover them. So really, I'm going to cover 6 parts of speech and try to reduce it so you don't get overwhelmed with how many parts of speech there are. So we're going to do 6 and focus on those 6 because those are really the essential parts of grammar and the ones that you're going to really need to know if you're going to get through this and get a good grasp on the logic of how the language works. Now, the other thing I'm going to do, which is probably for most folks new to you, is I'm going to group these into 3 different types. 3 different types based on how they function within our minds and how they function within our writing. And you're going to see this right from the start. First of all is understand that really for meaning in the human mind, when we make sense out of the world, we do it almost entirely with nouns and verbs. Those are the backbone of the English language, and in fact they're the backbone of almost any Indo-European or modern language, are the things you're thinking of in what they're doing or how you're describing them. So nouns and verbs are really what I'd call the first order. But please keep in mind, just learning those will get you nowhere, or will get you hardly anywhere. You might notice if you look at children's books, they're really filled primarily with nouns and verbs. Children's books focus on those because that's where most meaning is. They don't get into the detail and the complexity because you have a child. Really the core meaning is in the nouns and the verbs. So those are really what I'd call first order. Next order is adjectives and adverbs. And what these 2 parts of speech do is they add detail and precision to your thinking, to your speaking, and to your writing. Okay? To your thinking, to your speaking, and to your writing. Adjectives and adverbs, which I'll get more into, add precision to it. They add color, texture, nuance, detail. That's what they do. Adjectives are going to mostly define nouns. Adverbs are mostly, not entirely, going to modify verbs. That's what they do. Okay? So that's kind of the second order. So most of your content is really in these two types. The nouns and verbs are kind of the backbone of your thinking and your speaking and your writing. That's where the real meaning is. Things are doing stuff and they're being described. And then you nuance them and give detail to it with adjectives and adverbs. Okay? So second order. These two are really your backbone. These two give more nuance to it. Then you get to prepositions and conjunctions. That's the third type. Now, I want to make something very clear. What you don't want to do is just say, hey, I'll just learn about nouns and verbs and I won't worry about the rest. Or maybe you go a little bit further, you also don't want to do this and say, I'll learn about the adjectives and adverbs and I won't worry about these. That also won't get you very far. It will really restrict your understanding of language. So notice I don't really want to tell you that these are order of importance, because these are absolutely essential, the prepositions and the conjunctions, to writing at a more sophisticated level, to coming across and impressing upon people that you're a more sophisticated thinker, a more precise thinker, and you are an educated person. It's not about being aloof or talking down to people. It's about getting precision in your thinking. What prepositions and conjunctions do is organize these areas. They put them in certain areas and relate them to each other. These are the glue and the tape that stick it all together. Prepositions have a little bit of meaning to them, and so do conjunctions, but their primary thing is to organize these. They are the traffic cop that put all of these in places. They organize it, they relate things to each other, and good thinking is about precise thinking and about organized thinking. That's what prepositions and conjunctions do. So they are really related to each other because they organize this stuff. So it's three different types. So I don't want you to recognize or look at them as order of importance, but three different purposes to what they do. This will give you the content or the backbone. You can't help but think in nouns and verbs. We just do it automatically. As you learn to develop your ideas, you're going to be bringing in adjectives and adverbs. And I want to be clear, it's not just single words. It's going to be in words, phrases, and clauses. And then you organize those thoughts within the sentence using prepositions and conjunctions. All this stuff gets organized by those. So you see the three different types of words, words, phrases, and clauses are either going to be nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions, depending upon what they're doing. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do as I walk through chapter 2 is I'm going to kind of mix this up. I'm not going to follow these three different types, but I want you to be aware of them at first. What I'm going to do is teach nouns and adjectives together. Nouns and adjectives work together, very closely together. Okay? So I'm going to teach those in the first lecture because they often work together. Adjectives providing color, nuance, and detail for the nouns. That's what they do. So I'll teach those two together. One from the one type and one from the other type. Then what I'm going to do is spend time on verbs and adverbs for the same type of reason. They really work together. Now, a little warning ahead of time, verbs are far more complicated than people assume. They are far more complicated than people assume. But also I want to be very clear, everybody in this class can get them down. Okay? So if you assume, or if you remember from your earlier lessons that verbs are actions, that's half right, but totally misleading. If you hold on to that idea of verbs, that they're just actions, you will never understand how verbs really work, which is in far more nuanced ways than that. So I'm going to go into a lot of detail with the verbs. Adverbs are fairly easy once you understand how verbs work. Okay? And then we're going to be working with prepositions and conjunctions toward the end. Conjunctions especially when we get to chapter 4. Prepositions are going to come up in chapter 2 and then especially in chapter 3 because prepositions have a really funny function. These two types of or parts of speech, by the way, don't have much meaning to them. They're all about organization. So they, again, like I mentioned before, you can't really tell what the word of means. It's very hard to define yet. Okay, you probably could, but it's very difficult to do it. But everybody knows what a table is, or what the color blue is, or running rapidly. These are harder to define. They're organizational words. These are going to be a little bit easier to deal with. Okay, so understand that's what we're going to do in chapter 2. We're dealing with the parts of speech. I'm going to simplify it by reducing it really to 6 that are the most necessary. That's part of the whole bad grammar approach. But then there's going to be 3 types. The first type, nouns and verbs. The second one, adjectives and adverbs. And then prepositions and conjunctions. I'm going to approach it over the next few videos and in this book. Nouns and adjectives together, verbs and adjectives together, and then we're going to get more into those.